Volume 2, The Architecture of Influence Part 2. Chapter 13, Influence and System Predictability. Predictability is the condition in which the legal system produces outcomes that follow its structural logic. Predictability does not mean every case ends the same way. It means outcomes remain aligned with authority, procedure, institutional role, and the system's internal architecture. Influence affects predictability because it shapes how rules are interpreted, how procedures are applied, how evidence is evaluated, how remedies are selected, and how enforcement is prioritized. Predictability emerges when influence operates within defined boundaries and supports the system's structural patterns. Influence strengthens predictability by guiding institutional judgment toward outcomes that remain consistent with the system's design. It stabilizes interpretive practices, aligns procedural application, harmonizes institutional priorities, maintains coherent enforcement patterns, and supports consistent remedial selection. Influence helps the system produce outcomes that are structurally foreseeable, even when circumstances vary. Predictability is not created by eliminating variation. It is created by ensuring variation stays within the system's architecture. Influence can also create unpredictability when it exceeds structural limits. Unpredictability appears when discretion is exercised inconsistently, when procedures diverge across institutions, when interpretive variation becomes excessive, when enforcement priorities shift without structural justification, or when capacity constraints distort outcomes. These problems do not come from influence itself. They come from influence operating outside the system's boundaries. Predictability requires influence to remain aligned with authority, procedure, and institutional competence. The system preserves predictability through several structural mechanisms. Hierarchical authority ensures that higher-level rules control lower-level decisions. Standardized procedures create consistent pathways. Institutional oversight monitors how decisions are made. Review and appeal mechanisms correct misalignment. Consistent interpretive frameworks stabilize meaning across institutions. These mechanisms do not remove influence. They regulate it so that influence reinforces predictability rather than undermining it. Predictability is achieved when influence operates within defined limits, reinforces procedural order, supports interpretive consistency, aligns institutional behavior, and preserves system coherence. Influence is not a threat to predictability. It is a structural force that, when properly bounded, ensures the system produces outcomes that are stable, coherent, and foreseeable across time. Chapter 14, Influence and System Integrity. System integrity is the condition in which the legal system operates in accordance with its own architecture. Integrity is not a moral judgment. It is a structural measure of whether authority is applied correctly, whether procedures are followed, whether institutions act within their assigned roles, whether outcomes align with the hierarchy of norms, and whether coherence is preserved across time. Influence affects integrity because it shapes how these structural functions are carried out in practice. When influence stays aligned with the system's design, integrity remains stable. Influence supports integrity by guiding institutional judgment toward outcomes that remain consistent with the system's foundational structure. It stabilizes interpretive practices, reinforces procedural compliance, aligns institutional behavior, maintains consistent enforcement, and preserves coherent remedies. Influence strengthens integrity by ensuring that variation stays within structural limits. It helps institutions respond to real-world conditions without drifting away from their assigned roles. Influence can also threaten integrity when it exceeds the boundaries defined by authority and procedure. Integrity becomes unstable when discretion is exercised outside structural limits, when procedures are bypassed or applied inconsistently, when institutional priorities diverge from assigned roles, when enforcement becomes unpredictable, or when interpretive variation disrupts coherence. These problems do not come from influence itself. They come from influence operating without structural constraint. Integrity requires influence to remain bounded so that decisions stay aligned with the system's architecture. The system preserves integrity through several structural mechanisms. Hierarchical review ensures that higher-level authority controls lower-level decisions. Procedural safeguards create predictable pathways. Institutional oversight monitors how decisions are made. Standardized interpretive frameworks stabilize meaning. Mechanisms for correction and appeal restore alignment when errors occur. These tools do not eliminate influence. They regulate it so that influence reinforces integrity rather than undermining it. Integrity is achieved when influence operates within defined limits, reinforces procedural order, supports institutional competence, maintains interpretive consistency, and preserves system coherence. Influence is not external to integrity. It is a structural force that, when properly bounded, ensures the system remains aligned with its own architecture across time. Chapter 15: Influence and System Legibility. System legibility is the condition in which the structure, processes, and outcomes of the legal system can be understood through their internal logic. Legibility does not require the system to be simple. It requires the system to be traceable, meaning that decisions can be followed back to authority, procedure, institutional role, interpretive structure, and operational capacity. Influence affects legibility because it shapes how these structural components appear in practice. When influence stays aligned with the system's architecture, legibility remains strong and the system's operations remain understandable. Influence supports legibility by guiding institutional judgment toward outcomes that reflect the system's internal structure. It stabilizes interpretive patterns, reinforces procedural pathways, aligns institutional behavior, maintains coherent enforcement, and supports predictable remedial structures. Legibility increases when influence produces outcomes that clearly follow the system's logic. Even when circumstances vary, decisions remain understandable because they fit within the same structural framework. Influence can also undermine legibility when it operates outside structural boundaries. Illegibility appears when discretion is exercised inconsistently, when procedures diverge across institutions, when interpretive variation becomes excessive, when enforcement becomes unpredictable, or when capacity constraints distort outcomes. These problems do not come from influence itself. They come from influence that is unbounded or misaligned with authority. Legibility requires influence to remain within the system's architecture so that decisions remain traceable and coherent. The system preserves legibility through several structural mechanisms. Hierarchical authority ensures that higher-level rules guide lower-level decisions. Standardized procedures create consistent pathways. Institutional oversight monitors how decisions are made. Review and appeal mechanisms correct misalignment. Consistent interpretive frameworks stabilize meaning across institutions. These mechanisms do not eliminate influence. They regulate it so that influence produces outcomes that remain understandable within the system's logic. Legibility is achieved when influence operates within defined limits, reinforces procedural order, supports interpretive consistency, aligns institutional behavior, and preserves system coherence. Influence is not external to legibility. It is a structural force that, when properly bounded, ensures the system remains understandable, traceable, and transparent across time. Chapter 16: Influence and System Efficiency. System efficiency is the condition in which the legal system performs its functions without unnecessary delay, duplication, or waste. Efficiency is not the same as speed. It is the alignment between authority, procedure, institutional capacity, operational demands, and informational flow. Influence affects efficiency because it shapes how institutions navigate these structural components. When influence stays within the system's boundaries, it helps institutions operate smoothly and maintain a functional pace that supports stability. Influence supports efficiency by guiding institutional judgment toward actions that reduce friction within the system. It helps streamline procedural choices, align institutional priorities, support effective resource allocation, stabilize interpretive practices, and reduce unnecessary variation. Influence enables institutions to operate within structural limits while minimizing operational waste. Efficiency emerges when influence directs decisions toward outcomes that keep the system functioning clearly and coherently. Influence can also undermine efficiency when it exceeds structural boundaries or becomes inconsistent. Inefficiency appears when discretion is exercised unpredictably, when procedures diverge across institutions, when interpretive variation increases complexity, when enforcement priorities shift erratically, or when capacity constraints distort workflow. These problems do not come from influence itself. They come from influence operating without alignment. Efficiency requires influence to remain bounded so that decisions support rather than disrupt the system's operational flow. The system preserves efficiency through several structural mechanisms. Standardized procedures create predictable pathways. Hierarchical authority ensures that decisions follow the correct order. Institutional coordination aligns behavior across units. Review and oversight mechanisms monitor how decisions are made. Consistent interpretive frameworks stabilize meaning and reduce unnecessary complexity. These mechanisms do not eliminate influence. They regulate it so that influence reinforces efficiency rather than undermining it. Efficiency is achieved when influence operates within defined limits, reinforces procedural order, supports coherent institutional behavior, aligns resource allocation, and maintains system stability. Influence is not external to efficiency. It is a structural force that, when properly bounded, ensures the system functions with clarity, coherence, and minimal operational friction. Chapter 17: Influence and System Resilience. System resilience is the capacity of the legal system to maintain functionality, coherence, and authority under stress. Resilience is not resistance to change. It is the ability to absorb disruption while preserving structural integrity. Influence affects resilience because it shapes how institutions respond to pressure, how procedures adapt to strain, how interpretations adjust to new conditions, how enforcement continues under constraint, and how remedies function when circumstances shift. Resilience emerges when influence operates within the system's boundaries and supports continuity during instability. Influence strengthens resilience by guiding institutional judgment during periods of stress. It directs flexible application of rules, aligns institutional priorities, supports continuity of essential functions, maintains procedural order, and reinforces hierarchical authority. Influence helps the system remain operational even when conditions deviate from the norm. It ensures that adaptation under pressure remains controlled rather than chaotic, allowing the system to bend without breaking. Influence can also undermine resilience when it exceeds structural limits. Fragility appears when discretion becomes inconsistent under pressure, when procedures break down across institutions, when interpretive variation increases unpredictably, when enforcement becomes erratic, or when capacity constraints distort outcomes. These problems do not come from influence itself. They come from influence operating without structural constraint during periods of stress. Resilience requires influence to remain aligned with authority, procedure, and institutional competence. The system preserves resilience through several structural mechanisms. Hierarchical authority ensures that higher-level rules guide decisions even under strain. Standardized procedures maintain order when conditions are unstable. Institutional coordination keeps essential functions aligned. Review and oversight mechanisms monitor how decisions are made during disruption. Consistent interpretive frameworks stabilize meaning when uncertainty increases. These mechanisms do not eliminate influence. They regulate it so that influence supports continuity rather than contributing to breakdown. Resilience is achieved when influence operates within defined limits, reinforces procedural stability, supports institutional competence, maintains interpretive consistency, and preserves system coherence under stress. Influence is not external to resilience. It is a structural force that, when properly bounded, ensures the system remains functional, adaptive, and stable even in adverse conditions. Chapter 18: Influence and System Adaptability. System adaptability is the capacity of the legal system to adjust its operations to changing conditions without altering its foundational architecture. Adaptability is not structural revision. It is operational flexibility that stays within the boundaries of authority, procedure, and institutional role. Influence affects adaptability because it shapes how institutions respond to new demands, how procedures accommodate variation, how interpretations adjust to context, how enforcement adapts to constraints, and how remedies evolve within limits. Adaptability emerges when influence guides operational change without exceeding the system's structural boundaries. Influence supports adaptability by directing institutional judgment toward context-appropriate actions. It aligns procedures with current conditions, stabilizes institutional priorities, guides proportional enforcement, supports context-sensitive interpretation, and maintains continuity of essential functions. Influence ensures that operational adjustments remain coherent and predictable. Adaptability is not improvisation. It is structured flexibility shaped by influence operating inside the system's architecture. Influence can also undermine adaptability when it produces drift instead of structured adjustment. Drift occurs when discretion becomes inconsistent, when procedures diverge across institutions, when interpretive variation exceeds limits, when enforcement becomes unpredictable, or when capacity constraints distort decisions. These problems do not come from influence itself. They come from influence operating without alignment. Adaptability requires influence to remain bounded so that operational change does not become structural deviation. The system preserves adaptability through several structural mechanisms. Hierarchical authority ensures that operational adjustments remain aligned with higher-level rules. Standardized procedural frameworks provide stable pathways for variation. Institutional coordination keeps operational behavior aligned across units. Oversight and review mechanisms monitor how decisions are made. Consistent interpretive structures stabilize meaning even when conditions shift. These mechanisms do not eliminate influence. They regulate it so that influence produces controlled operational variation rather than drift. Adaptability is achieved when influence operates within defined limits, supports procedural flexibility, maintains interpretive consistency, aligns institutional behavior, and preserves system coherence under changing conditions. Influence is not external to adaptability. It is the system's internal mechanism for adjusting operations while preserving structural identity. Adaptability is the expression of influence working in a controlled, predictable, and structurally aligned way. Chapter 19: Influence and System Coordination. System coordination is the process through which institutions align their actions, procedures, and interpretations so the legal system functions as a unified whole. Coordination is not optional. It is a structural requirement that ensures authority flows predictably, procedures operate consistently, institutions act within their assigned roles, and outcomes remain aligned across time. Influence affects coordination because it shapes how institutions interact within this architecture and how they maintain alignment while carrying out their responsibilities. Influence supports coordination by guiding institutions toward actions that preserve structural alignment. It harmonizes interpretive practices, stabilizes procedural pathways, aligns enforcement priorities, supports consistent remedial structures, and facilitates the flow of information across institutional boundaries. Influence ensures that institutional behavior remains compatible across the system, allowing different components to operate together without conflict or fragmentation. Influence can also undermine coordination when it exceeds structural limits. Discoordination appears when institutions diverge in interpretation, when procedures are applied inconsistently, when enforcement priorities conflict, when resource constraints distort behavior, or when communication pathways break down. These problems do not arise from influence itself. They arise from influence operating without structural constraint. Coordination requires influence to remain aligned with authority, procedure, and institutional role. The system preserves coordination through several structural mechanisms. Hierarchical authority ensures that higher-level rules guide lower-level decisions. Standardized procedures create predictable pathways for institutional interaction. Institutional oversight monitors how coordination is maintained. Review and appeal mechanisms correct misalignment. Formal and informal communication channels support the exchange of information needed for coherent action. These mechanisms do not eliminate influence. They regulate it so that influence reinforces system-wide alignment rather than institutional drift. Coordination is achieved when influence operates within defined limits, reinforces procedural order, supports interpretive consistency, aligns institutional behavior, and preserves system coherence. Influence is not external to coordination. It is a structural force that, when properly bounded, ensures the system functions as an integrated, unified architecture. Chapter 20: Influence and System Feedback. System feedback is the process through which the legal system observes its own functioning and responds to what it learns. Feedback is not external commentary or outside evaluation. It is an internal structural mechanism that allows the system to detect operational strain, identify procedural inconsistencies, recognize interpretive divergence, observe enforcement patterns, and assess institutional performance. Influence affects feedback because it shapes how information is interpreted and how institutions decide what the system's signals mean. Influence supports feedback by guiding institutions in interpreting information about system performance. It stabilizes interpretive frameworks, aligns institutional priorities, clarifies procedural expectations, supports coherent evaluation, and maintains structural focus. Influence ensures that feedback is understood within the system's architectural logic rather than through isolated or conflicting institutional perspectives. When influence is properly bounded, feedback becomes a reliable tool for understanding how the system is functioning. Influence can also distort feedback when it exceeds structural limits. Distortion occurs when discretion alters the meaning of information, when institutional priorities override structural signals, when procedures are selectively applied, when interpretive variation obscures patterns, or when capacity constraints limit accurate assessment. These problems do not come from influence itself. They come from influence operating without alignment. Feedback becomes unreliable when influence reshapes information instead of helping the system understand it. The system maintains accurate feedback through several structural mechanisms. Hierarchical review ensures that higher-level authority interprets information consistently. Standardized reporting pathways create predictable channels for transmitting operational data. Institutional oversight monitors how feedback is collected and used. Procedural transparency ensures that information is visible and traceable. Consistent interpretive structures stabilize meaning across institutions. These mechanisms do not eliminate influence. They regulate it so that influence supports accurate feedback rather than distorting it. Feedback is effective when influence operates within defined limits, supports accurate interpretation, reinforces procedural order, aligns institutional behavior, and preserves system coherence. Influence is not external to feedback. It is a structural force that, when properly bounded, ensures the system can observe itself, adjust operations, and maintain functional integrity across time. Chapter 21: Influence and System Learning. System learning is the process through which the legal system incorporates information from past operations to improve future performance. Learning is not improvisation or policy. Preference. It is a structural mechanism that allows the system to refine procedures, stabilize interpretations, adjust institutional priorities, improve coordination, and strengthen coherence. Influence affects learning because it shapes how information is interpreted and how adjustments are implemented. When influence remains aligned with the system's architecture, learning becomes a reliable tool for long-term stability. Influence supports learning by directing institutional judgment toward adjustments that remain consistent with the system's structure. It stabilizes interpretive frameworks, reinforces procedural pathways, aligns institutional behavior, clarifies operational priorities, and supports coherent adaptation. Influence ensures that learning strengthens the system rather than altering its foundational design. Learning becomes a structural process rather than a reaction to isolated events. Influence can also distort learning when it exceeds structural limits. Distortion occurs when discretion overrides structural signals, when institutions misinterpret feedback, when procedures are selectively adjusted, when interpretive variation obscures patterns, or when capacity constraints limit accurate assessment. These problems do not come from influence itself. They come from influence operating without alignment. Learning becomes unreliable when influence reshapes information instead of helping the system understand it. The system preserves accurate learning through several structural mechanisms. Hierarchical review ensures that higher-level authority guides how information is interpreted. Standardized evaluative processes create consistent methods for analyzing performance. Institutional oversight monitors how learning is implemented. Procedural transparency ensures that adjustments are visible and traceable. Consistent interpretive structures stabilize meaning across institutions. These mechanisms do not eliminate influence. They regulate it so that influence supports learning rather than distorting it. Learning is achieved when influence operates within defined limits, supports accurate interpretation, reinforces procedural order, aligns institutional behavior, and preserves system coherence across time. Influence is not external to learning. It is a structural force that, when properly bounded, ensures the system can refine itself, improve performance, and maintain functional integrity across changing conditions. Chapter 22: Influence and System Memory. System memory is the accumulation of interpretations, procedures, institutional practices, and operational patterns that persist across time. Memory is not nostalgia or historical record. It is the structural residue of past decisions that shapes present and future operations. Influence affects system memory because it determines which interpretations become stable, which procedures become habitual, which institutional behaviors persist, which enforcement patterns solidify, and which remedial structures become standard. Memory emerges from repeated influence operating within structural limits, forming the patterns that define how the system behaves across generations. Influence forms system memory by guiding which practices are repeated and reinforced. It stabilizes interpretive patterns, reinforces procedural pathways, aligns institutional priorities, maintains consistent enforcement, and supports coherent remedial structures. Memory forms when influence produces predictable, repeatable outcomes that become embedded in the system's operations. Over time, these repeated patterns create the structural continuity that allows the system to function reliably. Influence can also distort system memory when it exceeds structural boundaries. Distortion occurs when discretion produces inconsistent patterns, when procedures diverge across institutions, when interpretive variation becomes excessive, when enforcement becomes unpredictable, or when capacity constraints shape outcomes irregularly. These problems do not come from influence itself. They come from influence operating without alignment. Distorted memory weakens the system by embedding irregular or unstable patterns into its long-term behavior. The system preserves memory integrity through several structural mechanisms. Hierarchical authority ensures that higher-level rules shape what becomes part of memory. Standardized procedures create consistent pathways that stabilize practice. Institutional oversight monitors how memory is formed and maintained. Review and appeal mechanisms correct misaligned patterns before they become permanent. Consistent interpretive frameworks keep meaning stable across institutions. These mechanisms do not eliminate influence. They regulate it so that memory reflects the system's architecture rather than institutional preference. System memory is stable when influence operates within defined limits, reinforces procedural order, supports interpretive consistency, aligns institutional behavior, and preserves system coherence across time. Influence is not external to memory. It is the structural force that determines what the system retains, how it evolves, and how it maintains continuity across generations of institutional practice. Chapter 23: Influence and System Boundaries. System boundaries define the limits within which authority, procedure, and institutional action may operate. Boundaries are not obstacles or restrictions on judgment. They are the structural edges that preserve coherence, predictability, stability, legitimacy, and institutional identity. Influence interacts with boundaries because it determines how institutions navigate the edges of permissible action. When influence remains aligned with the system's architecture, boundaries become clear, stable, and functional. Influence supports boundary navigation by guiding institutional judgment toward actions that remain within structural limits. It stabilizes interpretive practices, reinforces procedural constraints, aligns institutional priorities, maintains consistent enforcement, and supports coherent remedial structures. Influence ensures that institutions can operate near the boundary without crossing it. Boundaries become operational guides rather than barriers, helping institutions understand how far judgment may extend while still remaining aligned with authority. Influence can also create pressure on boundaries when it exceeds structural limits. Boundary pressure appears when discretion expands beyond authorized scope, when procedures are stretched or bypassed, when interpretive variation pushes structural edges, when enforcement becomes inconsistent, or when institutional priorities diverge from assigned roles. These problems do not come from influence itself. They come from influence operating without alignment. Boundary pressure signals that influence is attempting to reshape the architecture rather than operate within it. The system preserves boundary integrity through several structural mechanisms. Hierarchical authority ensures that higher-level rules define the limits of permissible action. Standardized procedures create predictable pathways that prevent institutions from drifting beyond their roles. Institutional oversight monitors how boundaries are respected. Review and appeal mechanisms correct actions that exceed structural limits. Consistent interpretive frameworks stabilize meaning so that boundaries remain clear across institutions. These mechanisms do not eliminate influence. They regulate it so that influence remains bounded and structurally aligned. Boundaries are maintained when influence operates within defined limits, reinforces procedural order, supports interpretive consistency, aligns institutional behavior, and preserves system coherence. Influence is not external to boundaries. It is the structural force that determines how institutions approach, respect, and operate within the limits that define the system's identity. Chapter 24: Influence and System Closure. System closure is the condition in which the legal system completes its internal processes in a manner consistent with its architecture. Closure is not finality or the end of legal activity. It is the structural completion of a cycle of authority, procedure, interpretation, and institutional action. Influence affects closure because it shapes how processes conclude, how decisions stabilize, how interpretations settle, how institutions finalize actions, and how outcomes integrate into system memory. Closure emerges when influence operates within structural limits and guides the system toward a coherent endpoint. Influence supports closure by directing institutions toward outcomes that align with the system's architecture. It stabilizes interpretive patterns, reinforces procedural pathways, aligns institutional behavior, maintains consistent enforcement, and supports coherent remedial structures. Closure is achieved when influence guides processes to their structurally appropriate endpoints, ensuring that decisions do not remain open, unsettled, or misaligned with authority. Influence can also undermine closure when it exceeds structural boundaries. Incomplete or unstable closure appears when discretion disrupts procedural finality, when interpretations remain unsettled, when institutional priorities diverge, when enforcement becomes inconsistent, or when capacity constraints prevent resolution. These problems do not come from influence itself. They come from influence operating without alignment. Unstable closure weakens the system by leaving processes unresolved or structurally inconsistent. The system preserves closure through several structural mechanisms. Hierarchical authority ensures that higher-level rules guide the final stages of decision-making. Standardized procedures create predictable pathways for concluding processes. Institutional oversight monitors how closure is achieved. Review and appeal mechanisms correct misaligned or incomplete outcomes. Consistent interpretive frameworks stabilize meaning so that closure reflects the system's architecture rather than institutional preference. These mechanisms do not eliminate influence. They regulate it so that influence supports structural completion. Closure is achieved when influence operates within defined limits, reinforces procedural order, supports interpretive consistency, aligns institutional behavior, and preserves system coherence. Influence is not external to closure. It is the structural force that determines how processes conclude, how outcomes stabilize, and how the system maintains continuity across cycles of operation. Excellent, James. We now reach the capstone of Volume 2. Below is the full TTS-ready rewrite of Chapter 25, The Limits of Influence, in the same stable voice and structural precision as every chapter before it. Chapter 25, The Limits of Influence. The limits of influence define the point at which institutional judgment must yield to authority, procedure, and structural coherence. Limits are not constraints on creativity or discretion. They are the boundaries that preserve system identity, system stability, system predictability, system legitimacy, and system continuity. Influence is powerful, but it is not absolute. Its limits are essential to the system's architecture because they ensure that judgment operates within the framework that gives the legal system its structure and coherence. Influence operates effectively only when it remains within the system's structural boundaries. These boundaries are defined by hierarchical authority, procedural requirements, institutional roles, interpretive frameworks, and operational capacity. Within these limits, influence strengthens the system by guiding variation, supporting adaptation, and enabling context-sensitive judgment. Beyond these limits, influence destabilizes the system by disrupting alignment, weakening coherence, and undermining predictability. Influence gains its power from being bounded, not from exceeding its scope. Influence fails when it attempts to override the architecture rather than operate within it. Failure occurs when discretion replaces authority, when procedure is bypassed, when institutional roles are exceeded, when interpretations lose coherence, or when enforcement becomes unpredictable. At this point, influence ceases to function as a structural force and becomes a source of systemic distortion. The system cannot rely on influence that attempts to reshape its architecture because such influence undermines the very conditions that allow judgment to function. The system enforces the limits of influence through several structural mechanisms. Hierarchical review ensures that higher-level authority corrects decisions that exceed structural boundaries. Procedural safeguards create predictable pathways that prevent institutions from drifting beyond their roles. Institutional oversight monitors how influence is exercised. Interpretive standardization stabilizes meaning across institutions. Corrective and appellate mechanisms restore alignment when influence produces distortion. These mechanisms ensure that influence remains a tool of the system rather than a force that reshapes it. Influence is most effective when it is bounded. Its power comes from operating within defined limits, reinforcing procedural order, supporting interpretive consistency, aligning institutional behavior, and preserving system coherence. The limit of influence is not a weakness. It is the condition that allows influence to function as a stabilizing, adaptive, and integrative force within the legal system. Influence strengthens the system only when it remains aligned with the architecture that defines the system's identity. Volume 2. Summary and Conclusion. Influence defines the range within which a system can move. It is the measure of how external forces shape motion, redirect behavior, and alter the trajectory of structures that would otherwise remain stable. Throughout this volume, influence has been treated not as a social or psychological concept, but as a structural condition, a bounded field of force that determines what a system can and cannot become under pressure. The chapters have shown that influence is always constrained. It operates within limits, it decays with distance, and it cannot produce outcomes beyond the structural capacity of the system it acts upon. Influence can accelerate motion, redirect it, or suppress it, but it cannot create identity, stability, or continuity on its own. It is a force that acts upon structure, not a substitute for structure. This distinction matters because it defines the boundary between what can be changed from the outside and what must be understood from within. Influence reveals the edges of a system's flexibility. It shows how far motion can be pushed before resistance becomes structural. It clarifies the difference between adaptation and distortion, between guided movement and forced deviation. With these limits established, the architecture now turns toward the conditions that remain when influence is removed. If volume 2 has mapped the field of motion under external force, the next volume examines the structures that persist regardless of that force. Influence describes what can be altered. Order describes what remains stable. Influence explains variation. Order explains continuity. Influence reveals the boundaries of motion. Order defines the framework within which motion occurs. This is the natural progression of the system. Having defined how external forces act upon structure, the next step is to define the structure itself. Volume 3 begins at that point, with the rules, constraints, and patterns that give a system its stability, its predictability, and its enduring form.